Q&A portion of today's presentation. We are very excited to have with us today John Hirschfield, a seasoned clinician within the field and the director of the OCD and Anxiety Center of Greater Baltimore. Once again, thank you for joining us. I will now pass it along to John to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. So just before we get started, I just want to say, when you specialize in a particular area of mental health, it's very challenging to distill everything that people need to know within an hour. So what I've done here is sort of taken lots of different angles and perspectives on OCD treatment and tried to put them together into one talk. And hopefully you'll walk away with a sense of having greater understanding of all that goes into treating this disorder. So getting started, just what we're going to go over is some basic OCD 101 for those of you who aren't experienced treating OCD or new to learning about OCD. Then I'll go into more specifics about the treatment strategies that we employ. We'll talk a little bit about the role of the family and nature versus nurture and things like that. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have time for some good Q&A. So starting with the very basics of the basics, we're talking about a disorder that has a lifetime prevalence of 2.3% in adults and about 1% in children. So that means that at any given point in somebody's life, they've had OCD, they've met the clinical criteria for it, represents 2.3% of adults. And we know that this is a disorder that has biopsychosocial origins, meaning part of it is about learned behavior, part of it is about specific structural differences in the brain. We know that genetics is somehow involved. We don't exactly understand how. We do know that it's the fourth most commonly diagnosed psychiatric condition, and it's in the top 10 of the World Health Organization's most debilitating disorders. We also know that it runs in families. I mentioned genetics, and we'll talk more about that later. And slight female predominance, though in my practice I see a pretty even mix of men and women with the disorder. So obsessive compulsive disorder is one of those disorders you pretty much know a lot about just by knowing the name of the disorder and its definition. So it's made up of obsessions and compulsions. So what is an obsession? It's an unwanted, intrusive thought, image, or urge. It's associated with discomfort. It's often repetitive. And it's typically ego dystonic. So what we mean by this is the person having the thought finds it strange that they're having a thought. It doesn't line up with their assumed identity. It doesn't line up with their preferred values. Part of what's distressing about it is this idea of, why am I thinking this? Or that's very strange. I would never want to do these things, or I should know better than to find this problematic, and yet it really disturbs me. In previous iterations of the DSM, included the word impulses, but some changes in the way this disorder is classified. Now it's in its own section, obsessive compulsive disorders. They switched out impulses and I think replaced it with images. If you're treating people with OCD, you might find that they get caught up in this word urges, because urges kind of sounds like desires, and that's not really what it means in the OCD context. It's more like unwanted intrusion in your body. It felt like I was going to turn my car into oncoming traffic, or it felt like I wanted to jump off a ledge, but I don't want to, and I'm disturbed by having this urge, this feeling. And then there are compulsions, which are behaviors, physical or mental behaviors that are engaged in for the purpose of seeking certainty, to generally to prove that the unwanted thoughts are untrue or the feared outcomes won't come true. And they're aimed at relieving distress associated with the obsessions. And I always make a point of explaining to clients that not everything you do to feel better when you're triggered by an unwanted thought is necessarily compulsive. Of course, breathing exercise or physical exercise, or maybe even in some cases some light forms of distraction could be okay. But really what we're talking about compulsions, are strategies that are aimed at the content of the unwanted thought. The goal is to get certainty about the unwanted thought and prove to yourself that it won't come true. Obsessions come up in a lot of different ways. Literally anything could be an obsession. If you can think it, you could turn it into an obsession. Usually it comes up in these types of patterns. So what if XYZ happens, right? What if I get sick? What if I get hit by a car? What if I spread an illness? What if I snap and hurt someone? Sometimes it comes up in terms of what if I did something wrong or irresponsible? So you get obsessions about the past. I'm seeing a lot of clients, especially now, with obsessions about concern about whether or not they may have behaved inappropriately in college. They're triggered by a lot of things they see in the news about the Me Too movement and things like that. And then again, they have, well, what if when I kissed that girl in college, she, how do I know for sure that she wanted me to kiss her? And getting into this state of, what if I'm not who I thought I was, and I'm actually this terrible person? Sometimes the obsessions come in the form of, what if others would be horrified by this if they knew that I was having an intrusive, violent, or sexual thought? What if this is the wrong thing to think, feel, or sense? So you'll see a lot of moral obsessions along these lines. Another one is what if I never stop thinking or experiencing this? So we sometimes call that stuck thought OCD, where someone just has a thought in mind, or maybe they're hyper aware of a bodily sensation like blinking or swallowing. And then the fear is, what if my mind never disengages from it and my whole life experience is commandeered by this obsession? And then sometimes obsessions don't really show up as what if questions, or if they do, the what if is more about what if it doesn't go away. But the obsession itself is presenting as a spontaneous presentation of something disgusting, offensive, or unwanted. So this almost being blindsided by a thought. You're changing your child's diaper, and then you have an intrusive sexual thought, and you're kind of thrown by it. Why would that happen? And you're horrified by it. And it doesn't always come with this very kind of intellectual, what does this mean? So much as just, why am I having to deal with this thought right now? A little bit more about compulsions. So they're physical or mental behaviors. Again, they're designed to increase certainty about the content of thoughts. What I found is that, most of the time we're talking about increasing certainty that the fears won't come true. Most people that you see with OCD have pretty good insight, and they're aware that these thoughts are kind of garbage, junk mail, but they just don't know how to handle them. But in more severe cases where the insight is lower, I will sometimes encounter people who are just as invested in trying to prove that their thoughts are true as that they're untrue, because they're still trying to get rid of this very discomforting sense of uncertainty, and sometimes trying to build their case for the OCD as a way to do that. Compulsions are typically viewed as a prerequisite for moving on. I'll wash my hands and then I'll move on. I can't imagine moving on with the rest of my day knowing that my hands might be contaminated. Part of what makes it a disorder, of course, is that it's time-consuming. It impairs social functioning, professional functioning. Typically, the standard view is it takes up at least an hour of your day dealing with obsessions and compulsions. And of course, it temporarily reduces anxiety and disgust or other distress. I mean, there's a goal in mind, but it's temporary, which we'll go into more soon. A little bit about the background of OCD. So one thing to understand with people with OCD is that they have an overactive orbital frontal cortex. What that means is that very front part of the brain that is more enhanced in ourselves, separates us from monkeys. It's the thinking center of the brain, and there have been some studies that have shown just a lot more activity there. So if you can imagine, having an intrusive thought and your body is telling you that you're in danger, that there's a threat somewhere, and then the person responsible for dealing with that threat in your mind is just incredibly overactive, hyperactive, constantly churning over all the potentials. So this is a bit what someone with OCD is going through. Their analytical part of the brain is sort of on fire. The good news is, with appropriate treatment, they've actually shown that this settles down a little bit. We know that chemical messengers in the brain, neurotransmitters, are somehow related to OCD. These include serotonin, dopamine, glutamate. There may be some others. The reason why the most commonly prescribed medication for OCD is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors is because in studying selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they found that at higher doses, people reported less obsessional thinking. So we don't really understand why it works, only that this OCD must have something to do with serotonin. We know that in terms of genetics, the risk of having OCD goes up considerably when you have a first-degree relative that has OCD or a related disorder. Typically, my clients have at least one first-degree relative. It's not always true, but usually they do. And of course, they're not always diagnosed. There are specific genetic markers that are being narrowed down. There's good research that Dr. Gerald Nesta at Johns Hopkins has been doing for years, trying to just sort of figure out, if there's like one genetic thing that says, okay, this is the OCD gene. And what they keep coming up against is, no, there's not one specific gene. There's very likely a complex combination of genes and how they interact with one another that results in the predisposition to developing the disorder. Family environment does have an impact on OCD, and I think the way you want to think about this is if you're predisposed to having OCD for biological or genetic reasons, then there are certain environments where the OCD is likely to manifest or likely to be made worse or not worse. So we know that children whose parents are authoritarian are more likely to have OCD symptoms. We know that over-interfering and overprotective parenting might be a contributor to increased OCD symptoms. High expressed emotion, just seeing mom get very upset about things, and particularly negative expressed emotions, is also correlated with a higher rate of symptoms in children. So the question is, chicken or egg? Are the parents causing the OCD, or is the OCD causing the parents to, be more reactive and to be more rule-oriented, trying to control the child's behavior? And we don't really know the answer. I mean, there's really no real evidence pointing to, well, this kind of family is going to give this kind of kid OCD. It's more of a complex relationship of reciprocation between the parenting, the symptoms, and how it kind of bounces back and forth throughout the family system. So this is called the obsessive-compulsive cycle, and this is the first thing, and we're going to go into treatment later in the talk, but this is the first thing you're going to show people probably when you're explaining OCD, and it's really very simple. You have the obsession, the unwanted intrusive thought, image, urge, and it causes distress because it's something you don't want to think about. It's an uncertainty that you aren't very open to tolerating. And to relieve this distress, you engage in something called a compulsion, which again could be an overt act or it could be a mental ritual. And the problem with compulsions is they sort of kind of work. They do make you feel a little bit better in that moment temporarily. And this triggers a kind of reinforcement in the brain. So the way I explain this to my clients is that brains, as complicated as they are, they fundamentally use a binary code just like computers. It's, do I repeat this or don't I repeat this? And you're more likely to repeat something that's reinforced than something that isn't. And this particular kind of reinforcement, it's called negative reinforcement because it's removing the distress, is especially powerful. So the moment that happens, I have this unwanted thought about being dirty, I feel this distress and this disgust, I wash, I feel clean, I feel safe, and the brain kind of goes click. Every time you feel that way, you should probably wash. And so this primes the pump for the next obsession. Obsessions are, after all, repetitive and intrusive, so you're going to feel dirty again, and except this time it's going to be tagged with additional information. That feeling dirty is definitely important. We know because you've had to engage in this, elaborate washing ritual. The only way to deal with it is to do your compulsion, right? Because the brain has no idea you have OCD, so it's assuming everything you're doing is a good idea. And, you can't handle this distress or this uncertainty, and you kind of end up bullying yourself into doing the compulsions again, triggering more negative reinforcement, and around we go. And one way to think about the difference between someone with OCD and someone without OCD is really the intensity with which this cycle gets started and gains momentum. Whereas if you don't have OCD, you might get caught up in this loop a little bit, but you get kind of irritated and they're able to kind of walk away from it. The negative reinforcement there isn't quite as intense. In the assessment process, we do a clinical interview like you would for anyone coming in for any problem. And of course, you ask a lot of questions about their mental health history and their OCD symptoms. I like to use the Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. It's not the only measurement tool for OCD, but it's good as a nice list of common OCD symptoms. And one of the things that's especially nice about that is it gives you an opportunity to say, here are symptoms that are very common. Do you have any of them? Because a lot of the symptoms that people with OCD have, they feel a lot of shame about and they're afraid to admit, especially in regards to sexual obsessions or unwanted violent obsessions. So being able to say, okay, so these are very common things. Do you have any intrusive thoughts about impulsively harming someone? Do you have any intrusive thoughts about, being of another sexual orientation than your assumed or preferred one? And then I also give my clients, when I think it's appropriate, which is most of the time, family accommodation scale, which is the chance for them to rate how much accommodation is happening at home, how much reassurance seeking is happening, how much family members or caregivers are helping to facilitate the engaging in compulsions. And then parents have a version of it as well that they can fill out. And in the best of circumstances, the numbers sort of match. But what you see a lot of times is that the family is less aware of how much they're accommodating, or more aware of how much they're accommodating. And when it doesn't match up, that's an opportunity to kind of bring everyone together and say, okay, we're going to work on this like a team. So what are some common obsessions that come up? So the one that we usually think of the first is contamination. It's the one that's easiest to portray on television, so we have it fresh in mind. So this manifests as fear or disgust with bodily fluids, germs, chemicals, solvents, sometimes animals and other things. Occasional encounter emotional or spiritual contamination, things that aren't actually substances but still have this sense of it, it's on me, I need to get it off. Checking and responsibility themed obsessions are also very common. So the fear of causing catastrophes, my home is going to get robbed because I didn't lock the door, or house is going to burn down because I didn't turn off the coffee machine. And so you see a lot of checking of light switches, checking of appliances, checking blocks, checking to make sure the stove is off is a common one. Harm or aggressive obsessions, I treat a lot of that. So these are unwanted, intrusive fears of a violent nature. What if I were to snap and stab the person sitting next to me? What if I were to snap and turn my car into oncoming traffic? What if I harbor a kind of harmful identity, sort of a fear of being in denial of closeted sociopathy? Sexual obsessions are also more common than you might think, because people have a lot of difficulty talking about them. So fear of losing one's sexual orientation or of having inappropriate sexual impulses, fear of acting out aggressively sexually towards others, fear of being in denial of being another orientation or another gender. Intrusive thoughts about being a pedophile are also very common and disturbing to people who have a lot of trouble for good reason. Fear of getting help and fear that someone who doesn't understand OCD is going to immediately jump towards mandated reporting rather than asking, do you want these thoughts? Tell me about your experience of having them. How do they make you feel? What kind of behaviors are you engaging in response to them? Scrupulosity or religious obsessions or moral obsessions. So you'll see a lot of people who are having trouble navigating the inherent ritualistic nature of their religion without becoming too rigid. So you'll see obsessions that are very specifically aimed at making sure they're performing their religion exactly perfectly right, for fear of retribution, going to hell and things like that. You'll also see obsessions that involve intrusive thoughts about things that are inappropriate, like sexual thoughts about their higher power when they're at their place of worship, for example. And then moral obsessions are also very common, and people have difficulty talking about them because they feel like they're a bad person when they come and they tell you, well, I have intrusive thoughts that maybe I cheated on my partner somehow, but I don't really know how I did it. I just have this thought that maybe I did it. Fear of not being perfectly honest, fear of not having the right reactions to things or not caring enough about things. Just right and symmetry obsessions is something that will come up. So these are people who are just getting a sense of incompleteness or offness, who are then doing compulsions to try to fix or even up that sense. So you might see people going in and out of a doorway multiple times until it feels right, or getting up and down from a chair, lining up objects in a certain way. And with symmetry obsessions, sometimes it's just related to the discomfort, like I'm not going to be able to, move on to the next task unless I've perfectly lined this thing up on my desk. Or it might be tied to some magical thinking of, if I don't put this in the exact right space, maybe it's going to give a loved one a disease or something like that. Relationship theme obsessions, so these are intrusive thoughts about the quality of one's relationship. Maybe I don't really love my partner, maybe I married the wrong person, maybe I'm meant to be with a different kind of person. Maybe what I know about this person and their past is something that I'm going to obsess about forever, and so I can't be with this person because I can't stand being with them while thinking about this obsession. And of course, with each of these, they have their own complications. With relationship-themed obsessions, especially, we're not assuming that the relationship itself is actually any good. It might actually be an unhealthy or a toxic relationship, and so asking the right questions becomes important. Almost all the time, what I see when it's someone with OCD is that the relationship is, basically fine, but the OCD has sort of targeted a very specific detail about the relationship and is making it seem like there's no way they can be happy. And of course, this comes with a lot of guilt because underneath all of that, there is love for their partner and they do want things to work out, but they just can't stop thinking about ways in which it might not work out or they might not have the right feelings. Hyper-awareness or sensory motor obsessions are interesting. So these are thoughts about involuntary bodily sensations, typically blinking, breathing, swallowing, position of the body in space, anything that we kind of take for granted that if we thought real hard about it, I think any reasonable person could make themselves feel a bit disturbed, like, oh, even as I'm talking about it right now, I'm thinking about swallowing and I have my coffee here. And well, what if I never stopped thinking about swallowing and my whole life was just about, am I swallowing? Am I swallowing at the right time? Do I need to swallow? So the treatment for hyperawareness and sensory motor obsessions is the same as other types of OCD, but sometimes requires a little bit of nuance because it isn't always easy to identify what the compulsions are or even what the feared consequences are. And then you have existential obsessions, which sometimes share territory with religious obsessions. And these are really just not being able to let go of uncertainty about the nature of existence. And, what if there is no self? And what happens when we die? And, how are we all just getting along with this idea that we're floating on a rock in space? Isn't anybody else disturbed by this? And you'll see compulsions that, involve a lot of reassurance seeking and research and catastrophizing about, you're trying to prove that they're somehow going to get the answer. So a lot of compulsive philosophizing. So interestingly, the way OCD manifests in children is not really all that different from the way that it manifests in adults. And it's important to understand that because sometimes children will tell you that they're having intrusive sexual thoughts, for example. A 9-year-old might say that they're having intrusive thoughts of having sex with people or stabbing people in their privates or things like that. And someone who's not able to understand the nature of intrusive thoughts and someone who's not trained in treating OCD might jump the gun and presume that this child is being abused or traumatized in some way. And I can just tell you from experience that that's not the case. I mean, OCD is OCD, and it kind of goes after what works. So that's something to be aware of. Maybe with kids, you might be more likely to have superstitious or magical beliefs because, they learn about the world through ritual. And it can be challenging to diagnose OCD in particularly young children because, they are learning the world through ritual and repetition and things like that. And so something might look like OCD, that's really just how 4-year-olds behave. But if a young person's coming to your office and they can't stop crying because they think that their mother's going to die because they stepped on a crack in the sidewalk, that is going to be should be looked at as a symptom of OCD. So a lot of the obsessions will involve concern for safety of their parents or fear that their parents would disown them or stop loving them, if they only knew about the horrible thoughts that I have. And I've treated several adult clients who, had intrusive thoughts, age 9, 10, 11, of a kind of, violent or sexual or disgust-based nature, who felt that they couldn't share those thoughts because it might freak their parents out or because it might cause them to be taken away. And they have to just kind of live with that fear, that sense that they're broken, that something's wrong with them. And these people often don't find out that they have OCD until they're adults. And working with that particular population is very interesting because the treatment is the same, but the OCD has really taken very deep roots. It often takes more than 10 years for people to actually get OCD-focused treatment for their OCD, if they're lucky to ever get a diagnosis. And you can just imagine how horrible it must be for a child thinking that they're a burgeoning serial killer, that they can't talk about their thoughts, and doing everything they can to distract themselves or hide their symptoms from people, and then taking that through puberty and into adulthood. What you see from that population that isn't hiding is reassurance seeking. Is it okay that I had this thought? Do you think I'm a bad person if I had this thought? And then, of course, questions about danger. Is this going to hurt me? Is it going to, am I going to get sick if I eat this? And then family accommodation is going to play a major role, like addressing the family accommodation. Is the family facilitating, the child taking a 3-hour shower until they feel clean? Or is the family answering all of these questions about, do you think I would ever hurt someone? Or, removing objects, hiding all the knives in the house, for example, for fear that it might trigger the child. So let's talk about compulsions. So like I said before, we have physical and mental compulsions. So mental rituals is something to pay very close attention to, because if you're only treating the physical stuff, a lot of people get misdiagnosed. Oh, that's not OCD. You don't wash your hands very much. And that is a major problem, because the people who are not doing physical compulsions as much, or primarily mental compulsions, they're also the ones who are dealing with the largest amount of shame and guilt for having these thoughts. And so to be told that it's not OCD can actually be really traumatizing for them. So there's a lot of different kinds of mental rituals. We don't have time to go into detail on every single one of them, but mental review, sort of replaying conversations or replaying scenarios to try to get certainty about them. Thought neutralization, which is, if you have a bad thought, trying to force yourself to repeat it, replace it with a repeated good thought. Compulsive prayer is a common one as well. Other compulsions that you might see are repeating compulsions. So someone might be doing something over and over again until it feels right, or until they've done it with the right thought in mind. So if I walk through a threshold, like a doorway, while having an intrusive thought that my child might die today, I might feel this strong urge to go back in through the doorway and do it again while thinking about my child being healthy. That would be a good example of a compulsion. Evening up, trying to do things the same on one side as the other, and arranging compulsions. Staring compulsions, counting compulsions. Ritualized daily routines, needing to do things in a certain order, like put your clothes on in a very specific way or a specific order, and not being able to be flexible with that. Of course, washing and cleaning rituals are very common. Excessive showering and grooming. I also see a lot of clients, some of them are what I call frequency washers, and some of them are called, I call them process washers, and some of them have both. So frequency washer is someone who's just using a lot of hand sanitizer, and they're washing their hands just a lot, but not in any particular ritualized way, yet it's still taking up a lot of time and impairing their functioning, because they always have a reason to wash their hands. And then process washers are the ones where you see very careful attention to what order they're washing each individual finger, under the nails, and then there's a ritual for how they rinse, and then maybe they get the soap off, and then they re-soap up, and they have to wash a certain number of times in order, those types of things. Checking and repeating the checking, going, locking and unlocking a lock over and over and over again until they get that feeling that it's, okay to walk away. Avoidance, avoiding the triggers, avoiding triggering media, triggering, songs, television shows, movies. You can imagine a person with unwanted, intrusive thoughts about harming children might, drive some circuitous route around the school to make sure that they don't, see any children there, so they don't have to obsess about whether or not they would want to do something or did something. And then reassurance seeking, of course, asking somebody else to tell you that your fears are not going to come true, or that you're not a bad person. And thanks to the internet, we have a lot of research reassurance seeking. So if you have health anxiety, you might be laboring over WebMD. You might have be rereading emails from your therapist that seem reassuring, and of course a lot of self-reassurance, repeating things. I know my thoughts can't harm me, or, I would never do that, and things like that. So a little bit more about mental rituals. A good way to think about them is that these intrusive thoughts are viewed as contaminants of the mind. So some people wash their hands and some people wash their minds. They're trying to get the thought to go away. So we used to call this pure O until we realized that that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because these people are definitely doing compulsions. It just might not be easy to see. They're covert compulsions, and they go unnoticed. And they're often overlooked by treatment providers. So again, really getting at the heart of asking why, what are you doing in response to these unwanted thoughts, not just physically, but what's the sort of thought process follow-up when dealing with this uncertainty? Because even the sufferer can be unaware. They might think they're just, thinking about stuff, when in fact they're doing a very specific ritual to try to get certainty. So here's a quick list. I already mentioned some of these, and in the interest of time, I think we can skip past this. But these are kind of common ones. One that's probably worth mentioning is self-criticism and self-punishment, because I think that gets overlooked as, as a compulsion. So it might be, if you have moral obsessions, so you have this sort of unwanted, intrusive thought that you might have done a bad thing, you might have a compulsion to simply treat yourself really badly, to say mean and negative things to yourself. And what's interesting about this is, if you work with clients of any disorder on self-compassion, in this particular population, self-compassion can actually be a form of exposure therapy, actually giving yourself a fair shake. You just have to kind of walk that line between self-compassion and offering reassurance. So getting to the heart of how do you treat this disorder. So we have the core elements of CBT are psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and behavioral therapy, which is the RP. So on the psychoeducation front, we go over the obsessive-compulsive cycle and negative reinforcement, which we already did. And then we talk about, what happens when we try to catch and resist compulsions. We try to break this cycle. What we want to happen is one of two things, or two of two things, which is habituation and inhibitory learning. And we go over this, in detail. So habituation, in short, is feeling less of the feeling in the face of the same trigger. So if you have contamination OCD and you're afraid of germs, we might touch something we think is germy and resist washing our hands. And we do this over and over and over again until we kind of bore the brain. Oh, this again. Okay, so that the strength of that urge to do compulsion starts to go down. The problem with habituation is it puts all of our stock in making anxiety go away, as if anxiety were the problem. But anxiety is not always the problem. It's actually psychological flexibility that's the problem. So newer models of understanding exposure therapy actually emphasize inhibitory learning. And the short version of that is creating, through repetition of exposures in different contexts and in different ways, you're creating multiple non-threat associations with the trigger. And those kind of fill the mind and inhibit it from going to that place of intolerable fear. A good example, a good metaphor I like to use is watching horror movies. I like scary movies. I like to go to the movie theater, buy my ticket, and think, oh, I hope this is scary. I don't want it to be boring. And then the monster jumps out, and I get scared. And if you caught me in that moment and did an analysis of my body, I'm probably not having a good time, right? My body is reacting in fear. And yet, as soon as it's over, I go back to my popcorn, because I've actually already embraced the idea that it's okay to be afraid in this setting. There's no part of me that wants to run out of the cinema. And that's what we want to accomplish with these obsessions. It's okay to be disturbed by some of this stuff. It's disturbing. And sometimes being afraid is an appropriate response, but that doesn't mean you have to do compulsions either. You basically learning how to stay in the presence of uncertainty without doing your compulsions, as opposed to learning that you don't have to be anxious. You're actually learning that you can be anxious and not do compulsions. And then in the first session, I might go over some basic mindfulness concepts to kind of give them a sense of, thoughts are thoughts, not threats. Next step in the therapy, I like to go over cognitive therapy. You have to be careful with cognitive therapy and OCD, because you don't want to get wrapped up in providing too much reassurance that might then, function as a compulsion. You don't want to co-ritualize with your clients. So the way I describe cognitive therapy is it's just identifying ways of thinking about your experience that can be modified to bring about healthier results. So what are cognitive distortions? They're just ways of thinking about an experience that encourage you to be compulsive. So here are some examples of cognitive distortions, which you guys are probably already familiar. All or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, magnifying, emotional reasoning, discounting the positive, selective abstraction. These are the ones that I see come up the most in OCD. And again, if you're able to, A, recognize that you're thinking, that's mindful. And if you can recognize that there's a tone to your thinking, which isn't say, oh, you're catastrophizing. You're saying, if I don't wash my hands, I'm going to get sick and die. You can then challenge that by saying, well, I can't predict the future, but, in my experience, my hand washing has not made my life much better, so maybe this is one of those times I should fight my OCD. Other cognitive distortions that are relevant, thought-action fusion is a big one. So that might be assigning probability to the frequency of thoughts. So if I think about mom getting sick too many times, it's more likely to cause her to get sick. Or assigning morality to the presence of the thoughts. The more thoughts that I have about harming my dog, the worse of a person I am. Magical thinking, right? If I think this, it's going to cause something outside of my head to occur, or because I thought it, it's more true. It's very similar to thought-action fusion. Mind reading, and you'll see a lot in this population of should and must thinking. So really just perfectionism and sort of rigidity of thought. I should always wash my hands in this situation, or I must never have this kind of thought at church or synagogue, for example. So one of the tools that you can use in cognitive therapy is called the automatic thought record. And again, the idea here is we're reframing the process of the thinking, not the content itself, right? We're basically challenging the assumptions of the cognitive distortions and not getting into debate about, well, this probably won't happen. I think, cognitive therapy in other, treating other disorders like depression, there is a bit of an emphasis on weighing the probabilities and trying to convince yourself that, it's probably not going to happen. Here it's really just about challenging distorted thinking and saying, hey, that's distorted thinking. I don't really know. I have to make a choice between doing compulsion or not doing compulsion. So our goal is really to get back to this very objective place. And now for the meat and potatoes of OCD treatment, which is called exposure with response prevention. So this is the behavioral part. This is the part that really makes the difference in the lives of people with OCD. So what are we doing? We're interacting with triggers and the discomfort that comes with them, and we're pairing that with the elimination of compulsive behavior. We're exposing them to their unwanted experiences, and then we're preventing the response or the ritual. So there's lots of research out there that shows that this is the first line intervention for treating of OCD. This has been consistently backed up by meta-analysis. And again, habituation's great. We want to feel less fear. That's a normal thing to want, but inhibitory learning is also important. And another way to think about this is habituation is feeling better, and inhibitory learning is getting better at having feelings. What are some rules when we're doing ERP? Because it can be kind of scary, and it can be an exposure for the therapist too, to do things that are going to dysregulate your client. We never ask them to do something that's actually harmful, but we think there's a likelihood that something bad is going to happen. We're just asking them to get into that space of uncertainty. And that's a collaborative process. I might think a client's capable of something and they might disagree, and then we're going to have to negotiate about, what they're willing to do and what really makes sense in overcoming the OCD. We would never ask somebody to do something that overtly violates their religious or moral tenets, particularly when working with religious clients who might have fears of sinning. The answer to that is not to just go ahead and sin. It's to figure out a way to get into that space where they're not certain if sinning could happen or did happen or might happen, and learn not to do compulsions in that space, recondition the brain. And then, of course, I'm not going to ask them to do something I don't think they're capable of doing, or something that I wouldn't do, because that's just not fair. Different kinds of exposures. We have in vivo exposures, which would be really just making direct contact. So this is your touching a doorknob, holding a knife, interacting with a person that triggers you. Imaginal exposures. This is, sometimes we can't actually get in front of the actual fear, so we have to create stories. And what's really cool about this is you can sort of hack the mind into thinking it's in danger simply by writing out the feared scenario and doing exposure to what you've written. And then there's interoceptive exposures, which means creating environments where the sensory experience of the fear is there. So if someone's afraid of having a panic attack, And the way they know they're going to have a panic attack is that they start to feel very hot or dizzy. You might have them, wear a sweater in a hot room and sit with that sensation of being hot, or you might have them spin around in a chair and sit with that sensation of dizziness. So traditionally, we've done exposure, especially when focusing on habituation, by developing hierarchies, right? It makes sense. You wouldn't teach someone to swim by pushing them in the deep end of the pool and shouting, swim at them. So we want to see, what can they tolerate, and what are all the different exposures we can do from easiest to hardest, and then work our way up that ladder. However, one of the things we know from inhibitory learning is that it's actually more effective when the exposure intensities are varied, when they're sometimes doing hard things and easy things and mixing them up, because we're really trying to get them to generalize that they can tolerate uncertainty. So I try to get the best of both worlds in my work, which is I start with a hierarchy to get them into the process of doing exposure therapy at a level that they really believe they can handle. And then we start to, be a little bit more adventurous and say, well, let's jump up a little bit, or let's go back to something easier, or let's try something in a different environment. And hierarchies typically fall apart as you do the work. So mindfulness is a big part of my practice. Of course, so I'm biased. I believe it's an essential part of understanding OCD. It doesn't mean that you have to start teaching mindfulness to everybody, or that someone who doesn't use mindfulness is doing a bad job. I just think, again, what mindfulness is, fundamentally is a challenge, is how you get to understand OCD. So I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to move forward even more quickly here. So mindfulness, in short, paying attention to the present moment and being non-judgmental about it, and letting go of that attempt to control what's happening in consciousness. And the central thesis here is that thoughts are mental events. Thoughts are thoughts, not threats. We don't really know what their value is. We don't know what they really mean. We just know that we're having a thought. We have all kinds of thoughts. Similarly, feelings are raw data. They're not facts. I can feel guilty. That doesn't mean I did something wrong. I can feel anxious. That doesn't mean something bad is happening or is about to happen. Physical sensations, and this is something that your clients are going to have the hardest time with, are really just nerves firing. So if you're watching something, and if you're a heterosexual person and there's a gay scene in a movie and you experience a sensation in your body, you might overreact to that and think, oh my God, I'm turning gay or something bad's happening. But if you can understand that, physical sensations come and go, just like thoughts and feelings, and they're really just data, they're not threats, that's a game changer. Very quickly about medication, I already mentioned SSRIs. The thing to know about SSRIs is they're unlikely to be that helpful for OCD unless they're at a pretty much the highest dose possible. Working with families, you really want to make sure that you're addressing accommodation. It's really frustrating when you're trying to help somebody and they're doing all the work in session and they're going home and they're coming back and they're not getting better. And then you find out that at home, their parents are facilitating all their compulsions. They're buying them all the extra soap. They're doing their laundry for them. They're facilitating the avoidance of things. They're turning the TV off whenever a triggering word might come up. And, of course, they're providing reassurance. I know you would never do this. I know you would never get sick, and all those things. Or promoting analysis. Let's be harder about this. If you were going to hurt someone, wouldn't you have had this thought, before, or wouldn't you have acted on it before? All of that is facilitating rituals. So here's some data. You guys can look at the slides later, just a little bit of information about accommodation. And, the short version of this is the more accommodation, the worse the symptoms. Less accommodations, the quicker people get better. Same thing with reassurance. An occasional reality check is okay. If someone doesn't actually understand how something works, and you tell them once, that's fine. But if you tell them twice, then we're starting to get into OCD. And the thing to remember about helping family members reduce reassurance is to get them to understand that they have to do ERP too. They have to deal with the same obsessive-compulsive cycle. The thought is, if I don't give my child or my partner this reassurance, they're going to lose their mind or they're going to suffer and it's going to be my fault. That's distressing. And then they give them the reassurance and they feel better about themselves and their loved one feels better for a second. And then, of course, it's actually making them worse. So to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give you reassurance. We've talked to your therapist about this. This is what we have to do to get you better. And to sit with that uncertainty and that discomfort, that's the family member's job. That's their ERP. One way to facilitate this is to have your clients do contracts and actually write out specifically, Mom, I give you permission to respond to these thoughts in this way, and even if I tell you it's not OCD, I give you permission to decide for yourself if it is OCD. And you can also use other strategies like having them write the reassurance, and then you can reduce the number of reassurance questions that they ask that way. Typical response is, that's a reassurance question. Sorry you're struggling. Changing the subject, having a code word can be helpful. Again, the more collaboration, the more out in the open everything is, the easier it is to work with. And again, you'll see this with children with OCD, working with their parents on this issue, but you'll see just as much of it with adults and their partners or spouses or their parents or even their children. So with partners, you want a heavy emphasis on reassurance contracting. And what's so important is that you reduce criticism and hostility. The best way you can do this is to help them actually understand what the disorder is and how it works. And you want them to be very conscious, too, of triangulating. Don't make your child your co-therapist. With children, incentivizing them to do their OCD homework can be helpful. Externalizing the OCD can be very helpful, giving the OCD a name, saying like, this thing is telling you that you're a bad person, but you don't need to listen to the booger. You can do this. So I recommend inquiring early about treatment, in treatment, about family accommodation, and let's cover some very quick case examples so that we can then get to the Q&A. So the two examples I have here. So one is a 38-year-old male with contamination OCD, fear of contracting and spreading illness via fecal matter. So you can picture somebody who's very much concerned with, I might get somebody else's fecal matter on me in some way, using a public restroom or maybe my own fecal matter because I didn't wipe appropriately or I didn't check enough. And then the idea is I might be spreading this. If people knew that I was spreading this, they might humiliate me and my life might be over. So you'll see compulsions like excessive and ritualized hand washing, avoidance in public restrooms, reassurance seeking. Do I smell? Do you think is there any chance I have anything on my hands? How many times do you wipe? Things like that. Mental review of the hand washing routine to make sure they washed appropriately. Maybe going back and washing 2 and 3 and 4 times to make sure that they aren't contaminated. And then requesting accommodation from family members, which might be time that they're giving. It might be that they're just spending a lot of time, waiting for this person to get out of the bathroom. They're supposed to go away on a trip, but this person's in the bathroom for an hour, so they're going to wait. Or it might be literally accommodating them by providing them with extra toilet paper, extra soap, or extra reassurance. So just thinking back to what I kind of plowed through before, the sort of treatment protocol, I would start with this person by explaining what OCD is and how it works, and try to normalize, what they're going through. One thing to remember about obsessions in general is that fundamentally, they're not irrational. I mean, nobody's really told me something that if it were true for me, I'd be like, oh, that's cool. I like that idea, right? Nobody wants to be sick. No one wants to have poop on them. No one wants to wake up tomorrow and be of a different sexual orientation or be a murderer or something like that. The way we're supposed to react to these things is to be a little disturbed and go, oh, that's a little disturbing, and then move on with our lives. And really, the person with OCD doesn't feel capable of doing that because they have to take that extra step of acknowledging the uncertainty and accepting the uncertainty. So the first thing I want to do is normalize, like, yeah, that's disturbing. I wouldn't want to be thinking that as well. But clearly the way that you're dealing with thinking about it is interfering in your functioning. And so, how would we know if you're better? And they'll always say, well, I'm spending more time addressing the things that I care about, my work, my family, just enjoying being alive on Earth. So we might do a little cognitive therapy on, challenging some of the distorted thinking around, why they think it's so important that they wash or how catastrophic it would be if a molecule of fecal matter got on them. And then maybe get into the ERP portion of it. And that, with a contamination case in particular, hierarchies can be helpful. So you might just start by very simply, having the person, like in this particular case, avoidance of public restrooms. So you're very unlikely to just start using public restrooms because you said so. And if they do, they're very likely to be engaging in a lot of rituals around that. So you might start by just having them touch the outside door of a public restroom at their office, and not even necessarily use it, just to get them started interacting with that space that they've been avoiding, and then work your way up. And every exposure is only as good as its response prevention. So one thing you want to think about is this person going to be able to do this exposure and resist the compulsion that follows, or delay, or at least delay or interfere in the compulsion that follows. So it's a lot of engaging with the fear and not washing. So you don't want to give them assignments where they're just going to get overloaded and then they're going to wash anyway, because that's actually reinforcing the problem. So sometimes you have to start very, very small. Another example here, just conscious of the time, 27-year-old mother with harm OCD towards her newborn. So I see a lot of postpartum OCD and perinatal OCD. So these are, unwanted intrusive thoughts about hurting the child. And they're wrapped up in a lot of, scary stories about, people they've read about online who've hurt their children, or, fear of snapping, or the fear of just finding out that, that you weren't good at being a mother, And, so in this particular case, the core fear is just, what if I stab my infant? And so the compulsions you're likely to see here, or in this particular case, be avoiding of knives or sharp objects. I had a client who was, locking all the knives into like a toolbox in the shed, all the kitchen knives, everything sharp. Reassurance seeking from the husband, a lot of online reassurance seeking and researching, watching videos and documentaries about Andrew Gates and stuff like that. And again, you might think that, oh, this is a good idea for exposure, but remember what they're doing mentally while watching these videos is trying to figure out what they have in common with these people to prove that they would never do these things. So in a case like this, it would be good to have them, watch a video, a documentary or something about a mother who harmed their child, but while doing that, have them tell themselves, or say out loud even, I might do that, or maybe that will happen to me, to try to stay in that space of uncertainty without the compulsions. Because if they're covertly ritualizing while doing it, it's no different than checking to make sure the stove is off. They're not going to get better that way. And in these particular cases, avoidance is a major issue, and you'll see mothers who just don't want to be around their children because the children bring up the thoughts, but then they deal with tremendous guilt about not being a present mother. So working in a hierarchical way of like, okay, so today, once a day, you're going to spend 5 minutes alone with your child, and you're going to let the thoughts do what they're going to do, and you're not going to do any compulsions. And you kind of build your way up from there to having them engage with the child and do activities with the child, again, while allowing these intrusive thoughts. And then the trick, of course, is also addressing the mental rituals, which is very important. Because if they're in their head saying, I know I would never do this because, or they're replacing these harm thoughts with, forcing images into their mind of the child being, in a protective bubble, again, they're still sending the signal to the brain that they're not okay and they're not going to be okay. We want to send the signal to the brain that it doesn't matter what thoughts they have, that they're confident and competent, and that's reflected in their behavior. So thank you for your time. That was quite a race through the world of OCD, and I hope you learned some things, and we'll get to some questions with the time we have left.
Awesome. John, thank you so much for the presentation. As you mentioned, we do have a few questions that came in, and I want to let everyone know that for those questions that we don't get to, we're going to include them with the slides on our website as well as the recording in a few days. So we'll definitely get to every question. So just to start off, one of the questions that came in was, some of these obsessions seem normal on some level. How do you distinguish when it is something more than just a normal obsessive thought?
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. I mean, I thinking mindfully, thoughts are thoughts are thoughts. I don't care what the content is. There's nothing, I don't believe that there is such a thing as an abnormal thought. But there are adaptive or maladaptive or healthy or less healthy or skillful or less skillful ways to respond to thoughts. So something like, I don't like the idea that if I don't wash my hands, I'm going to get sick. I'm not going to immediately diagnose that person with OCD. But if that person is spending, 3 hours in the bathroom trying to make sure that their hands are perfectly clean and it's impairing their functioning at work, well, then that is OCD. So we're not coming at it from the angle of, oh, this is a really weird thought. Even the thoughts that sound weird on the surface, like what if I stab my baby? What's at the core of that? I mean, who likes the idea that they're going to hurt their baby? It's not an unusual thought. When you see something that's vulnerable and completely dependent on you for survival, it's really normal to think about all the ways you could screw that up, But to respond to that thought immediately like it's a threat that you then have to neutralize, that's where we start to get into trouble. So I always try to normalize the thoughts and focus more on how is the behavior functional? And if it's not functional, how can we adjust it to make it functional?
Great, thank you. Another question along similar lines is there any research exploring the possibility that OCD is justified as the result of previous experience of trauma? In other words, because something bad did happen in the past, it seems reasonable to want to avoid recurrence through compulsive behavior.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is research out there and a lot of debate out there about the relationship between trauma and OCD. Some research definitely suggests that people who have experienced trauma are more likely to develop OCD symptoms. What hasn't been shown is that trauma causes OCD. So just because you've had a trauma doesn't mean you're going to have OCD, or that OCD is caused by trauma. So therapeutic interventions that are focused on trying to figure out, well, what happened to this person to give them OCD are unlikely to be effective. But in the case of somebody who, let's say they had been assaulted by someone, and now the way that they're kind of integrating that experience in their life is they're not leaving the house. Well, on the face of it, you could say that makes a lot of rational sense because they're unlikely to be assaulted in their own home and more likely to be assaulted if they leave the house. On the other hand, they're also allowing that traumatic experience to completely define them and to keep them from being able to work and contribute. They're basically handing over their lives to the trauma. So you want to look at how can we reconcile this extra vigilance, which is totally normal and understandable, with behaviors that are not only impairing functioning, but are actually contributing to the strength of the traumatic experience. They're not helping the person understand the trauma as a memory. They're actually feeding that part of the brain that thinks the trauma is still happening because they're not able to live their lives. So it's almost like they're still being traumatized by doing their compulsions. And it can be helpful, and I'm not one of these people, to work with someone who understands trauma very well and can kind of do both prolonged exposure treatments for the trauma and ERP for the OCD.
Great, thank you. I actually think that is all the time we have for questions, but as I mentioned, all the other questions that came in, as well as the recording and the slides for this presentation, will be on our website within 2 days, and our website is ctacny.org for those of you that asked. I do want to point out some resources that John was gracious enough to share. Again, this will be included in the slides, but it's the International OCD Foundation for other resources, as well as Anxiety and Depression Association of America. We do have a number of upcoming CTAC events that we would like folks to take a look at. So Why Youth Peer Advocates, Part 1 and 2, really getting at the core of the benefits of having youth peer advocates within your organization and really how to best work with them. And finally, there is a presentation that is happening on behalf of Practice Innovations. So the Improving Providers Assessment, Care Delivery, and Treatment of OCD, Impact OCD. They have a number of resources as well as presentations that are sponsored by the Office of Mental Health, and we would love for you to take a look at all of those. The website is at the bottom. We've included it within the slides, and we really implore you to take a look at that as an extra resource as well. So with that, we wanted to provide our contact information. Feel free to contact us with any questions or concerns. Again, our website is ctacny.org for anyone that is interested in getting the slides, the questions, as well as the recording following this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. And John, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.